All right, we'll get started. The first little bit's introduction. So as folks trickle in, it'll be all right if they miss that. So welcome everyone to our webinar. My name is Shane. We'll do introductions in a second. This is a webinar as part of the AGU Sharing Science webinar series, but we are very pleased today to have our colleagues from the Thriving Earth Exchange doing, I was going to say most, but essentially all of the heavy lifting. So briefly, before we get started, if you are unfamiliar with American Geophysical Union, or AGU, we are a big Earth and Space Science society. We have a whole bunch of journals. We have one big conference every year, which is happening right now virtually, that brings together in person and virtually in the 20,000+ range of folks every year, and a bunch of smaller conferences. Specifically, what we in Sharing Science do is we are scientists who help other scientists talk to non-scientists. So we provide scientists with skills, tools, resources, opportunities, whatever they might need to communicate their science to a broad variety of audiences, from community members to friends to colleagues to policymakers and journalists, whoever that might be. And we do this through a number of different ways. So you're in one of them right now. We have this webinar series every year. We also do workshops, both in person and virtual now. We have a bunch of online resources, website, Twitter, and we provide outreach opportunities, hands-on support, and more. So if you're interested in the science communication aspects of science, we are your kind of go-to folks. This is the last of a webinar series we did. It's called The Skills for a Complete Scientist, where we worked with a lot of our colleagues to do it. So if you missed any of the ones before you see on this list, or you're interested in viewing them, we have recaps of all of the webinars, plus a whole lot of other tools we've created, like infographics and videos and animations as well. We will have a follow-up email that'll happen after this webinar, where we provide all this information and where you can go to find that. As I said, my name is Shane Hanlon. I'm one of the two core folks in the Sharing Science program, the picture you see here on your left. Just briefly, I'm an ecologist by training. I dabbled in science policy right after I got my PhD, and I came to Sharing Science because I was really interested in doing a whole bunch of different things, and I loved the teaching and the training and the communication aspect of it. You also hear from my colleague, Olivia. Olivia, if you want to briefly introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Olivia Ambrosio. I too am a biologist by training, though that's merely coincidental. And really loved the research, but also had this connection to communication, and through a circuitous route ended up at AGU helping them develop Sharing Science, where I've been ever since, although I still take many opportunities to tell people everything that I can about marine life, whether they want me to or not.
Thanks, Olivia. And so this is probably the last you're really going to hear from us, because the folks who are really running the show today are our Thriving Earth Exchange colleagues at AGU. So Natasha, why don't you start?
Thank you, Shane. Thank you, Olivia. Hi, everyone. I'm Natasha Urugama. I'm the International and Community Engagement Program Manager with Thriving Earth Exchange. I'm pleased to be able to talk to you all today about a lot of our experiences doing global work in the last 6 years that I've been with the team. I have a disaster management background and I'm a geographer by training. Worked a lot in South and Southeast Asia, and currently hoping to get more international AGU members and other international organizations as partners with Thriving Earth Exchange. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Kelly.
Thanks, Natasha. Thanks, Shane. Thanks, Olivia. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly McCarthy. I work with Natasha and the rest of our Thriving Earth Exchange team that you see on the screen here at AGU. Our program connects scientists to communities to do community-driven science that advances local priorities. My background's in education and physics. I've done work in STEM education and federal policy, and worked on different climate education initiatives. And I've loved being part of the Thriving Earth Exchange this year. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Natasha and our two guest speakers. With that, I'll pass it over to our guest speakers to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Kelly and Natasha. Hi, everyone. My name is Florencia Zapata. I am Deputy Director of the Instituto de Montaña in Peru. I have a background in anthropology and environment, and I am very pleased to be participating today. Thank you.
And Tuga, if you could introduce yourself.
Yes, good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you also for AGU and Thriving Earth Exchange for inviting us to talk on this webinar. My name is Ingtonglak Cholombatar. You can call me Tunga. I am a co-founder of a local NGO called Public Lab Mongolia, and I will tell you a little bit about that later on. My background is in intercultural communications and refugee studies, but I am also studying medicine at the moment. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Great, thanks all. So before I hand it over completely, I want to just get a kind of a gauge of who is with us today. So I'm going to put up a quick poll that you all should be seeing now. So please just kind of a gut check. Take this poll for us. What's your confidence in initiating, maintaining professional relationships outside your geographic borders? So no matter where you are, if you can kind of gauge your comfort in reaching out a little bit farther. And I'll leave this up for about a minute. All right, looks like things are starting to level off. If you haven't voted, please do so. Close this in another few seconds. All right. So, oh, interesting. That is not a normal distribution. Okay, so that's good. I think that even if you are more confident or kind of on the lower range, you'll get something out of this today. So with that, I'm going to officially hand things over to Natasha to get us started.
Thank you, Shane. Hi, everyone. As I said, I'm Natasha Urugama. It's a pleasure to talk to you today. So Thriving Earth Exchange is a program of the AGU that fosters partnerships between communities of place, interest, action, and scientists to advance local priorities through an approach known as community science. Our mission at Thriving Earth Exchange is to strengthen and enhance collaboration among communities, scientists, and partner organizations so that all communities can build healthy, resilient, thriving, just, and ecologically responsible futures. Thriving Earth Exchange uses a community science approach, and we define community science as working with people on shared priorities in the places that they live, work, and play, offering our science with humility and honoring the knowledges that others bring. So in the last 7 years, Thriving Earth Exchange has co-developed our concept of community science and brought the term to the fore of AGU. In that time, we've learned a lot about how to build external relationships beyond our borders. The ideas and lessons learned in this session is applicable whether you're interested in doing community science or making robust professional connections outside of your country's borders. When Thriving Earth Exchange started back in 2012, we were specifically tasked with supporting community science projects within the United States. The rationale being that by learning how to do community science here within our own borders, we could then eventually learn how to adapt and translate our experience of community science to partners outside of our borders. Since 2015, Thriving Earth Exchange has experienced doing community science outside of the United States. So here's a little bit of a timeline of our activities outside of the country to give you a sense of where we've started and where we've come. So I'll just give you a quick history of all of our international activities. In 2014, we connected with a Cornell University human ecologist of Afghan origins on a project that helped support 17 villages of the premier mountains of Afghanistan and Tajikistan to adapt their traditional ecological calendars to a changing climate. By 2018, they were able to harvest peach and mulberry crops with the climate science knowledge that they gained through their connection with AGU that was then integrated into their traditional calendars. In 2015, during a trip of a lifetime that I made to Ethiopia for 4 weeks, I connected with the Horn of Africa Regional Environmental Center to discuss the possibilities of doing community science with them. This connection resulted in our second international project looking at water quality and quantity in the Zawai Basin of the Great Rift Valley, supporting mapping of the basin to support regional water policies. Then in 2016, as Thriving Earth Exchange was starting to learn that partnerships with community-facing organizations, those organizations that boast networks of different types of communities as their members, could help bring attention of our science to those communities that those organizations served. We developed our first partnership with an international community-facing organization, Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities. It was our first opportunity to be part of a consortium of service providers to over 100 international cities adapting 100 RC's resilience tools. Then in 2017, we continued to discuss and seek international connections through existing community-facing organizational partners that we were already working with, like ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, and ICMA, which both have international sister organizations or arms, and continue to learn from other societies like the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, about how they were developing their science and society programs. Moreover, other international connections resulted in an invitation to be part of a panel in Jamaica, which led to more connections, resulting in another community science in Montego Bay, Jamaica, that supported a local startup in obtaining scientific support to develop organic fertilizers from animal and human waste from area farming communities and hotels in the Montego Bay area. In 2018, we saw our leads growing and interest from AGU and our burgeoning international efforts. With the support of a newly formulated global engagement team at AGU, AGU's Global Engagement Committee, and Thriving Earth Exchange's board, we developed a goal of launching 9 projects outside of the US. By the end of that year, we had done a project launch workshop, a workshop in which we bring Thriving Earth Exchange scientists and AGU scientists and communities together to live develop new projects that included 2 international community leaders, one from the Dominican Republic and one from the Democratic Republic of Congo. By 2019, a fundamental insight was that community science projects are best managed locally through local programs emerged. We also expanded our goals to include developing partnerships with at least 5 partners outside of the United States. By the middle to the end of 2019, we connected with Public Lab Mongolia. My colleague Tunga will talk more about that later. During this time, we also connected with Future Earth Australia. And by 2020, as the pandemic encroached on our ability to travel, Thriving Earth Exchange's international strategy turned towards supporting our non-US partners in learning our community science approach, developing their programs, and starting community science projects managed by local staff. And that is what we hope to see more of in 2021 and beyond. Oops, sorry. So to reiterate, our goals for Thriving Earth Exchange when it comes to working with non-American partners is quite similar to what we're doing in the US at the same time. It is supporting organizations outside of our borders interested in adapting Thriving Earth Exchange's approach to community science for their region or country so as to increase their organization's capacity to support impactful community science projects locally, and also to build, host, and develop capacity for organizations outside of the United States to participate in a community science consortium. A non-US based entity interested in partnering with Thriving Earth Exchange should ideally be one that exhibits commitment to community science and has the time, personnel, and institutional resources to develop a community science program. That organization should show interest and promise in making community science a priority and should be willing to launch one or more projects to learn and implement Thriving Earth Exchange's community science approach. So what has worked well in terms of developing our global relationships? A few things that I've sort of noted in the last 6 years is that number one, international projects, if they're based outside of the US, are best managed, and this is kind of a no-brainer, by programs that are based in those countries with staff who understand the cultural nuances, the people, and can work well within those countries. Another lesson that I learned throughout the 6 years that I've been working on Thriving Earth Exchange and increasingly on international projects is to find and nourish a relationship with an organizational champion or a community champion that you can work well with. An organization and a community must be interested in the impact of science, have the capacity and the personnel and other in-kind resources and interest in adapting Thriving Earth Exchange's community science approach for that region or institution. And through multiple iterations of trying to figure out what international might look like, be ready to fail and learn from those failures. Failure is not something to be shy of and should be embraced. So if you are interested in learning more about international adaptation of community science, we are having a session at this year's fall meeting called Adapting Community Science for International Operations on December 11th. And you will hear, I'm so sorry. You will have a chance to hear more about our international adaptation from our partners in Mongolia, Australia, and Senegal. With that, I'll now turn it over to our partners in Mongolia and Peru, starting with Ms. Tunga Chulunbatar of Public Lab Mongolia. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. So we are a local NGO in Mongolia, and the reason I think we have been very attracted to community science as a concept and an approach to development is that we do want people to work together. And so our mission is to cultivate healthy environment and resilient communities through open data. We work a lot with making data available, work with youth on STEM programs, and lastly, we are now adapting community science as one of our core programming, which has been very exciting. So I'll tell you a little bit about how we get to meet Thriving Earth Exchange. So in 2019 summer, some of my colleagues, as well as some stakeholders from Mongolia, were able to visit the US to learn about different approaches to working on air pollution issues. So they formed a air pollution advocacy group and traveled to the US on a US State Department program called Professional Fellows. And they met with dozens or more organizations in the US and learning from their work and best practices, and one of which was Thriving Earth Exchange. So after their return, we have a discussion about, who we would best work with to bring that visit to a more long-term impact in Mongolia. So one of the organizations was Thriving Earth Exchange, because it really aligned with how we wanted to engage the public as a civil society in Mongolia. So then we invited Natasha back to Mongolia a few months later, and she was able to host a workshop for us. And the people you see in the photo are community members who attended the workshop from a central north central province in Mongolia called Arhange, and that is our first community to be working, to implement a community science project. And then we also realized that community science is, as a concept, is fairly new. In Mongolia, there has been a lot of development work that's being done, but it's a lot of foreign direct aid or preconceived projects that do not get a lot of input from community members, and then often fall short in delivering actual impact on the ground. And people have grown tired of different international projects. So that's why this community science approach was very much needed. And like I said, we are now adapting the community science as one of our core programming in Public Lab Mongolia, with the hope to really promote this approach to developing communities and building resilience. So from the partnership, we had a lot of work planned, but as with everyone, the pandemic has been limiting. But Natasha was able to, when she came in October of 2019, do a hands-on workshop with a community in Arhange to launch the community science project. And we have also gained training through online engagement on practicing community science. So this was very interesting because, like Natasha said, every place has different context. We may share a lot of same issues, but there is socioeconomic and cultural and other differences that really do make a difference in how things are done. And so, during this online training with Natasha and her team, we also had a lot of discussion on how to adapt, what to change, and what is not gonna work in Mongolia, and what might work, etc. And so, in terms of adapting the community science approach to the Mongolian context, we have focused a lot on communication and relationship building, which I think is universal in practicing community science, because you do want to build trust and kind of promote this deeper understanding of what community science is, and that might mean different ways of explaining, or just over time talking about this approach so people would get it eventually. So to build relationships, because this community is situated about 600 kilometers outside UB, my colleagues had went and visited them a few times. They had come to Natasha's workshop in the beginning. We keep in touch with them through phone. We don't use a lot of email, especially in rural communities. It's not a common practice. And one of the other things that also stood out as we were discussing, community science project, there is the word project. But in the Mongolian context, as it stands, project has become a very loaded word that usually signify a lot of money from foreign aid, and that these projects are not very effective. So even when we are doing translation, we need to be very mindful of these assumptions and people's thinking, so that we do send the right message. One of the other things that I wanted to highlight that was different is the culture of volunteering. So Mongolia has a lot of young people. I think 45% of our population is under 18 or 25, I'm sorry. And so we have a lot of young people, a lot of energy, and it's the sort of cultural norm is changing, that young people are involved in a lot of different activities and different leadership, activities and workshops and such. But still, like, purely volunteering is still a challenge for many people, because people are still, preferring to spend their time earning money, and volunteering is, sort of a privilege in Mongolia, especially if you were to ask that of young people, or even local scientists who, for their career would want to work in government agencies or institutions that do not pay very high, but have maybe more career prospects. So in terms of, implementing community science, we do need volunteer scientists. We do need, people from the community, or, young scientists or students to volunteer. So this was a little bit different, but we are still discussing different ways to engage aside from that. So this is a photo of the Arhangay. It has an extinct volcano and a big lake. It's really beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful tourist destinations, both for international and local people. And this is where the first community science project will be taking place in Mongolia. So in terms of how the collaboration has been working, we have taken our time to really, for us as Mongolian organization and team members, try to understand what community science is and how it's being done in the US. And then, discuss and think about how we might adapt it to Mongolia, because that in itself is a different process. So we are, in touch with Natasha and her team pretty regularly. We have questions and discussions and training sessions. And we have launched the first project. We had a lot of activities planned this past summer, but things are on hold. But we are still in touch with the Arhangay community members over the phone. Travel is a bit tricky now that Mongolia caught up to the rest of the world in having a community outbreak. We didn't have a community or local transmission until November 11th, and now there is a pretty strict lockdown. But otherwise, we are still in the process of translating community science to Mongolia and how we would actually implement it. And I talked a little bit about the adapting to COVID-19 situation. So what we are doing to not lose contact with the people that we established relationship with is, regular communication with the community leader on, changes or updates, or just, calling and saying hello and catching up on what's going on, just staying tuned in to the situation there, and also just kind of discussing, okay, let's wait until this time, or we will plan to do this, and etc. And we also use, like I said, email is not a big thing, especially for rural communities, but everybody uses Facebook. So we do use social media to also get in touch with people, or for the community members to just kind of stay tuned to our activities as well on Facebook. So I think that's all for my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions later on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tunga, for your very interesting presentation. And it is very nice to see Mongolia landscapes, which are close to some Andean landscapes too. And well, my name is Florencia Zapata. I work for the Instituto de Montaña, which is a Peruvian NGO working since 1995 in the Andes. And our work focused on supporting mountain communities in improving their livelihoods through sustainable management of mountain ecosystems and climate change adaptation. And we identify 3 words that summarize our work, which are conservation, culture, and community. And we see our role as facilitators, long-term partners of local communities and decision makers at local, regional, and national levels, bringing attention to mountains and their cultural and natural values. And for working with Andean communities, our main approach is participatory action research, which is based on knowledge dialogue. And you can see some of my colleagues in the picture on the right. And we started our partnership with Thriving Earth through a common friend, Erin Gleason, who used to work for the Mountain Institute and now is working at HU. And Erin thought that there were common interests between HU and Instituto de Montaña, which is right, because both engage communities in doing science through research projects that advance local priorities. Although Instituto de Montaña is not a research organization, we, as I mentioned, implement participatory action research as a core part of our projects. And then we have these close approaches, community science and participatory action research. And then we started a process of developing partnership and exchange with Natasha and her team, and started taking at the Instituto de Montaña, taking the Thriving Earth course, establishing a community science program. And what have we gained so far from partnering? Well, first, knowledge through training. And I would like to emphasize the thoughtful and amazing training resources, and especially the amazing personal trainer which Natasha is. And thank you, Natasha, for your time and patience. And also, it has been a very good opportunity for reflecting on our own work. How do we implement participatory action research, differences and similarities, mostly similarities, but also differences between participatory action research and community science, and how can we improve our own work through learning about community science. And we also gained resources to organize our own work, our own participatory research processes, because the training course provides materials and formats and a very well organized path to implement community science, which we want to adapt to our participatory research processes. And moreover, we gained a partner, and we are really very excited about that, a partner for community science cooperation, because we already established a network with researchers in Peru and abroad on how to, for our projects. But the difference, and which is a key one, is that HU, through the Thriving Earth exchange program, is this community science approach, which is very close to the way we understand our role as facilitators of research and knowledge exchange in the Andes. And we are gaining opportunities for exchange, and I think that we are just starting, which is amazing. And how has the collaboration been working so far? Well, we already have 3 members of the Instituto de Montaña trained, including myself, and we are starting a process for developing community science projects, particularly with one of the projects we have in the field, which is the Punas Agua project. Punas is the name of the ecosystem, grassland ecosystem in this part of the Andes where we work. You can see one of the pictures on the right. And one of the components of this project is to support communities on glacier retreat impacts on water quality. And for example, you can see one of the pictures with our stakeholders in the community of Canray Chico that are being trained on learning about the quality of their water that is being affected by glacier retreat. And now with the support of Thriving Earth, we expect to identify and improve solutions to this community concern. Thank you in advance for that. And to finalize, some thoughts regarding building relationships outside our geographies. As you know from the work you do at AGU, cultural sensitivity, humble curiosity, and knowledge dialogues are key ingredients. And this knowledge dialogue is important in the sense of creating and improving bridges between local knowledge and scientific knowledge. At the Instituto de Montaña, we work with local researchers, people from the mountain communities who are those who better know their context, their environment, their social organization, and then the scientific knowledge can help them to find solutions to their concerns. And in the time of COVID, well, we need to be more creative and adjust our strategies and resources to a changing context. And as Tunga mentioned, we are using a telephone, we are communicating through partners who are in the communities because internet connection is very low in many of the communities. And also we understand this as an opportunity for not only for supporting green recovery, but also to think outside the box. And we are developing the plans for going back to the communities when the government authorized that. And we really are very expectant regarding meeting again our partners in the community and discuss with them how this pandemic, how all this situation not only affected them, which we already know from the communication with them, but also the new thoughts and the new ideas for sure they have from this very peculiar moment in the history of humanity. And well, that's from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you both for sharing your work, your expertise with us. So for anyone, we're gonna wrap up here, but we're gonna have a lot of time for questions. If you have a questions there, or you have a question, there's a questions box in your little dashboard. A handful have come in, but please be sure to add more as well. Yeah, so you'll see our faces popping on here to actually see what we look like. But before we get there, I want to do one more poll for y'all. So it's the same poll, but just kind of a gut check. So same thing. What's your confidence now, having heard from our Thriving Earth colleagues and from our special guests on maintaining and developing these professional relationships outside your geographic borders? So we'll leave this up again for about a minute or so. All right, things are starting to level off. I'll leave it up for a few more seconds. If you haven't voted yet, please do. All right. Okay, good. So yeah, some movement there. Well, it's really great because it's good to see that a little bit more confidence in just the past 40 minutes. But there's a few more things to hopefully help boost your confidence. So I put this up earlier. This is our sharing science resources, but again, we will be following up with an email on resources on how not just Thriving Earth Exchange resources, but also sharing science resources if you're interested in the type of work we do. I'll come back to this slide as we're answering questions, but we are on all the social medias, both Sharing Science, Thriving Earth Exchange, our special guests. We have the Sharing Science community, which is a community dedicated to talking about all things science communication, policy outreach, science and society. If you're interested in this type of thing and you want a bunch of resources, you want a home where you can discuss this type of stuff with people who are also interested in this, we suggest you check it out. It's free to join. It'll take you a few minutes to sign up. You don't have to be an AGU scientist. Heck, you don't even have to be a scientist. So consider that. And then this is our last one. I'm actually just going to go back to this screen with all of our social media info on it. So that's everything. I think we have some questions that we can talk about.
Yeah, indeed we do. I think one that I'm going to start with for everyone, but I think Flor and Tunga, let me maybe ask you first. We have this question. For students, what are the most important skills we should be teaching for international and cross-cultural science?
Well, from our experience, history, history of the countries you are going to visit, and current situations, which are usually, at least in our country, moves very quickly, and then understanding the context and a little bit of language will be very helpful, at least to say hello and to interact a little bit. I think that being open, this is not something that you can teach, but perhaps to remember that being open to all new things you are going to live and experience, and being confident that all the good wishes and the energy and the knowledge you bring to the communities will be very well welcomed. And I think that's important to mention.
So just so I understand the question correctly, is it what do you recommend for students in the US if they want to do international science?
Excuse me, sorry, fly on my screen. That's a good question. It was not specified in the question. So I guess, really, you could certainly address it here, or are there things that you feel students anywhere should know as they prepare to be involved in any sort of cross-cultural science?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think Flor made some really good points, and I definitely agree with those. And, like Flor said, understanding context is, of course, very important. And another point that I just want to reiterate is understanding where other people are coming from. And, we all carry our own agenda and goals and objectives. When we go to meet different communities with those in mind, but like Flor said, we have to be open to what the other side is experiencing and what their priorities might be. And it's not going to be simple. So if it's about even local politics, you have to be aware of that, and really just try to get in there and understand people as people. I think, and humans are very complex beings, so there's a lot that goes in. But I think, yeah, like Flor said, being open to different ideas, yeah, and patient.
Thank you both. Natasha, was there anything you wanted to add in response to that question?
I think both Tunga and Flora had some great responses. I guess I would also say that it requires a lot of patience and a curiosity. I'd say, like a curiosity about different cultures, different people, different contexts. I think I've been very lucky that that was instilled in me at a very young age, and so I've always had a interest in different peoples and cultures. And if you can sort of just inform yourself about different places and just talk to as many people as possible, even reaching out by email or just saying hello and learning a little bit of different languages. I think that helps a lot, and it'll take you a ways in building those relationships that you need to build.
Thanks. Shane, do you mind asking folks the next one for a moment? I need to get one other question up, but it's
sure.
Trouble with this
So this might be we'll start with, I guess, you, Natasha. But how do you identify local science organizations in other countries, especially if you're just getting into the field in that region, if you're new to the region or new to the science in that region?
Well, that's what happened when I went to Ethiopia. I had never been to Ethiopia, and I basically, being an AGU employee, got a listing of all the Ethiopian members that we had, and we had 106 members at the time, and kind of did just a random cold calling of a few members. And then I just did my research in advance. What are some of the environmental organizations that might be doing work very similar to us? Because the Horn of Africa Regional Environmental Center was not one of those organizations that was already part of AGU. The executive director was a physicist at Addis Ababa University. He had no connection with AGU, but subsequent to connecting there, he's now become an AGU member. He's given a talk to all staff, and he's now even on our global engagement committee. So I would say just be curious and do your research. And if you are, many of you, I'm sure, are researchers, put those research skills to work. I think I've been very good about learning how to use my research skills to track people down. So that's definitely something that is useful.
Right. Another question for everyone is, what's the most important thing folks should take away if they want to maintain a scientific or professional relationship that transcends geography and culture long term? all the easy questions, right?
I think I'll let Tunga or Flora try to answer that first, and then I'm happy to chime in.
Sure, I'll go first. I think it will has to come down to building relationships. You know, especially community science is such a process-oriented approach to community development, and you know, this long-term relationship has to be fostered for it to actually make an impact. So it can't be just a 3-month project or whatnot. It needs to be, you know, one of those discussions we had with Natasha was, well, you know, what's the, you know, what we will become like as Public Lab Mongolia eventually, you know, so we're talking about community science and bringing it to Mongolia and promoting it and etc. And, you know, and our mission would be eventually that we don't need to be the facilitators, that different communities will have this idea that, you know, okay, we are going to go find, you know, a scientist who can help with us on certain issue, and we're going to take charge in organizing ourselves, and we're going to get insight from this scientist, and we're going to use that information or knowledge to our benefit. So, you know, from our perspective, the idea is this long-term focus on building relationship with communities and just being present until community science is so pervasive and you know, people understand and that you're eventually, you know, doesn't need to be an external facilitator.
Yeah, from my side, well, I absolutely agree with your points, Tunga. These are key, really key messages for all of us. And yes, in fact, when, for example, when we talk about participatory action research and participation, we always say that participation is just a name, but we need the second name or the surname. What kind of participation? What's the quality and the level of participation of people, local people engaged in doing science, and who produces knowledge? And from our experience, is essential to be co-producers with our local stakeholders and partners and friends. They are already friends. And then we have to be very aware of the power we have with ourselves when we go to a community, as both as facilitators or external researchers. Because at least in Peru, I don't know in Mongolia, but at least in Peru, when you go to the Andean communities, because of the history, and that's why history is so important, there is a historical way of relationships between scientists or politicians, external people, and the communities. And you need to talk about that, to reflect about that with your local stakeholders, and to reflect on your own role and situation and the power relationships. This is essential. And when conducting a research, both community science or participatory action research, reflecting on the process, an open reflection, both the teams of scientists, the facilitators, the local researchers, and in teams, and then all together, and monitoring the quality of the participation and who owns the process from the very beginning. Who owns the question, the research question? Who owns the solutions or outcomes or impacts or and even the authorship. Who owns the authorship when you produces a paper, for example? And then I think that perhaps in the future, our goal is to not be necessary as an NGO, right? Then people leading their research processes and the relationship with the universities and researchers. But this is something that we need to build yet. And then being reflecting on the process is essential for that. That's my thought.
Don't have too much more to add except that, you know, just staying humble, just seeing people as people, and just to reiterate what our director Raj says all the time, which is perturbing to the staff, but he'd like to see Thriving Earth Exchange go out of business, because you know, like, this should be something that's common everywhere, and can be done by the communities themselves.
Yeah, it's a great point. Let me ask one more question I think we have time for considering. How can scientists in the private sector, for example, scientific instrumentation companies and others, help change this equation of who does science, which often requires expensive instrumentation?
I can start. I think it's essential just to realize that while we are all scientists, often practicing what is basically Western science, modern science, it's important to realize that different communities come to the table with different types of knowledge, and there is science all around us. Eastern types of scientists, there's Ayurveda. All of this is science that is oftentimes sort of not considered as part of modern science. So sometimes it's important just to strip away your titles as a scientist, that you are at the essence a part of a community, and there are different types of communities that you're part of. So just try to just realize that that you can just talk to people as people and try to understand what those priorities are. And when it comes to you know, needing equipment, oftentimes in the case of a lot of our projects, the scientists who volunteer will bring in-kind resources from their universities. So try to talk to your leaders, to your organizational leaders, about ways in which you and other colleagues might be able to put forward your resources pro bono for opportunities like this. We are hoping to have more of a global movement around community science, where this kind of work, this kind of volunteer work that scientists are doing on community science projects will be more rewarded, not only by universities and other institutions, but also by the private sector. There's a really cool consulting company out of Golden, Colorado that recently contacted us, wanting to provide their consultants to Thriving Earth Exchange projects, because they have embedded in their culture that 10%, I believe it's about 10% of the time that the consultants do should be towards pro bono work. I thought that was an amazing example of what more and more consultancies and institutions should do in order to see this become more of an ongoing thing.
If I may provide example to Natasha's point from Mongolian context. So I'll give one example first. So Mongolia is one of the countries that's most disproportionately affected by climate change. And as you might know, Mongolia, we have a traditional nomadic culture that's based on livestock herding. And we still have that tradition in the rural areas. About 30% of the population still lives in the rural areas herding animals. But climate change, you know, has been happening, and we are seeing the impacts on these communities. So what happens is now, I think it's also a very common problem now everywhere too, is land conflict between, you know, herders and local agriculturalists, but also herders from a more drought or Zot is a word for Mongolian harsh winter that kills a lot of animals. When herders, experience this, they travel to other regions in the country for the season so that their animals could graze and live. But this also creates conflict, to the receiving locals. And one of those, things that the community wants to do is land management. But Mongolian government is very centralized, and there is no land law relating to herding and things like that. But at the local level, people still want to start taking some measures to organize themselves. And one of the things that where science could come in is higher resolution satellite imagery of these rural areas, because in Mongolia, we have only 3.2 million people, and very few of them are spread in the rural areas. So then the rural areas don't get a lot of update in terms of satellite imagery. So we don't see recent images of those, but more recent high-res images would certainly be very useful for these local community leaders to put in front of themselves and gather around it and talk about what's happening where. And then just one more example is we're implementing a program for youth on air quality education. And so where science came in for that is the University of Colorado Boulder made some of their equipment, which is air quality monitoring devices, available to us so that we could actually teach youth how to use and learn about air quality using STEM curriculum, which is really huge for youth who do not have access to these kind of resources or educational opportunities. So yeah, to support Natasha's point, equipment and any other simple things that might actually have really big impact on the local level.
If I can add something very short, very interesting. In the Andes, as you probably know, we have also very high impacts because of climate change. And interesting the contrast between, for example, land management in Peru, in the rural areas, communities, local communities are the owners and they manage their land. Although there are some conflicts not only between communities, but also between communities and private companies, between communities and central, local, and regional governments, because although communities own the land, a lot of decisions are taken outside the communities, and many of the decisions, important decisions, are taken from Lima, the capital, which is on the coast, very close, not only on distance, but also in cultural and social terms from the highlands where people live. And for example, in the case of Peru, just to give another example, a key resource is water. And we have a very deep concern from people from the highlands to the coast around water. Related with the climate change. And for example, in the example I brought before of the Puna's water project, we are in need of improving the capabilities of the communities to not only manage water, but improve the quality of water affected by glacier retreat. When glacier retreat, rocks are exposed to water and to air, and metals go to the water that people use for cattle grazing, for irrigation, and for human consumption. And we know that there are a lot of potential solutions that we want to test for helping these communities.
That's great. Well, We are a smidge over time. We thank you all for sticking with us. Like I said, we'll follow up with an email with a whole bunch of additional resources. But thank you to Natasha and Kelly, who's still on from Thriving Earth Exchange, and thank you, Florencia and Tunga, for sharing your expertise with us and be willing to be with us, in what are not our Eastern time zones here in the States. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you again to our speakers, and we will be in touch shortly. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Yeah, bye.
Bye-bye.